Gary Vaynerchuk talks about document versus create, right? Instead of coming up with something new every day, just document what you're doing, document your life. Now, how do we apply that to the church? We only have to simply document what God is doing because he's at work. And so when you start talking about how do we add value within the Christian nonprofit or Christian church space, it seems to me that the only thing that makes sense is documenting what God is doing, real life change, real testimony, real story, and providing value and leading with our marketing efforts with that kind of value add first. And then we can support it with all the other things that we're already doing. Hey, I want to talk about value today. Within the marketing world, value is incredibly important. How do we provide value to our audience? How do we give free value add content to our audience? That's pretty simple within the commercial world, right? That's lead generating PDFs and some type of content related to my service or my product. It's content on a consistent basis that either entertains or educates my audience. But when it comes to the church and the Christian nonprofit space, how do we provide value in that space? How do we lead our marketing efforts, our communication efforts with value, right? That's a difficult question to answer because we're not selling a product. We're not offering some type of service in most cases. This is the church we're talking about. And so it can't be a direct one-to-one correlation between what's taking place and what's successful in the world or in for-profit commercial space and slapped onto the church and we can claim success. Like that's just, I don't see it working. I don't see examples of it being very effective. And so when you look at marketing for the church and the nonprofit space right now, that's what it seems to be. It's just taking worldly business marketing tactics and applying it to the church and hoping there's success. Now, every Christian nonprofit or marketing agency or creative agency that I've looked at, they all say they are being successful, right? But when you look at the research that says that 80% of all new church growth is Christians moving from one church to another church, and the church in general in the West is declining, obviously there's something going on there. This is not really actually success. And so we have to think differently, right? If we're going to use digital, if we're going to engage with people where they're spending their time, if we're going to meet people where they're at, and the reality is they are in digital, right? 8+ hours a day. We're in front of our devices. We're on some type of screen. We're consuming some type of content. That is where people hang out. We have to be functional. We can't continue to be dysfunctional in that space and expect to be effective at reaching the lost. And so our marketing efforts, we have to make adjustments. Otherwise, we're going to continue this trend. We're going to continue to be irrelevant and dysfunctional in digital. And so when we start talking about value, how do you add value within the Christian church, Christian nonprofit space, lead with value? The only thing that makes sense to me is story and testimony, right? Because the thing about offering value and creating content in digital is that it has to be consistent and it has to be regular and it has to be a part of your DNA as an organization. You have to continually be offering and creating value in that space. And the thing about story and testimony is that there is intrinsic value in the story of a transformed life. It's always valuable. And on top of that, as we start talking about consistency and regularity with our content, our God is always at work. God is always at work. He's always transforming life. He's always rescuing people, redeeming people, healing people, entering into the brokenness and inviting and calling us out into something greater. He just is, right? He always goes before us. He is always at work. And so there is always content that we can generate around those stories and around those testimonies, around that life change. And so we serve a God that has given us more content than we could ever keep up with. Gary Vaynerchuk talks about document versus create, right? Instead of coming up with something new every day, just document what you're doing, document your life. Now, how do we apply that to the church? We only have to simply document what God is doing because he's at work. And so when you start talking about how do we add value within the Christian nonprofit or Christian church space, it seems to me that the only thing that makes sense is documenting what God is doing, real life change, real testimony, real story, and providing value and leading with our marketing efforts with that kind of value add first. And then we can support it with all the other things that we're already doing, our SEO and our Google Ad Grant Management and our inbound marketing and our lead gen PDFs and our 5 ways to deal with depression, felt needs articles. Like, all those things are good things. I would never say, let's stop doing those things. I'm just arguing for story first in our marketing, story first communication with our audiences, engaging through story. Simon Sinek talks about the difference between the limbic brain and the neocortex. I believe he says that the neocortex, right, is the emotional side of the brain. Until our limbic brain has been engaged through story and testimony or through narrative and story, until that limbic brain has been emotionally engaged, my neocortex is not prepared to receive any kind of information. It's just not. And so, again, how do we apply that within the church context? I talked about this in a previous video. We're trying to reach story-centric and orality cultures, communication cultures, with literacy-based means, with literacy-based communication. And it just doesn't work, right? We have to engage with the limbic brain first in order to start communicating with the neocortex. And so our marketing efforts have to function the same way. We're trying to reach audiences that are functioning in story-centric culture. They're functioning in digital and consuming content from a story-centric narrative perspective and point of view, right? Everything that we consume in those places, for the most part, it leads with story, or at least the successful brands in that space lead with story and narrative. And if we want to engage those audiences and break through the noise to engage with them contextually relevant to how they're behaving in those spaces, it has to be with story. It has to be with testimony, so that they're then prepared, because we've engaged with limbic brain, they're now prepared to hear our 3-point sermons and our literacy-based communications and our apologetic arguments and our 5 biblical ways to deal with depression, felt needs articles, right? That is the only way to me that makes sense for engaging and communicating with new audiences in the digital space. This is the greatest communication shift in human history, right? If the church doesn't take advantage of digital for the sake of the gospel, we've missed incredible opportunity. And so as we start thinking about our marketing efforts, as we start thinking about how do we engage with new audiences in those places where their attention is, and contextually relevant to those behaviors in those places, it has to be with story. And there's nothing that provides more value than a story of a transformed life. There is intrinsic value in the story of a transformed life. And so that's how I would encourage the church to start behaving. How do we make moves and shifts to be story first and testimony first in our communication efforts, engaging with people emotionally so that they're prepared to receive the gospel. I think you see this with the woman at the well and the man possessed by demon legion, right? In both situations, they have afternoon interactions with the Messiah, right? They have afternoon interactions with the Messiah, and in those afternoon interactions, especially in the case of the man possessed by demon legion, he says, I want to follow you the rest of my life. I want to be your disciple. And Jesus tells him, no, I need you to go and testify of all that you've seen here today, right? In both situations, they have an afternoon experience. They're not educated. They're not seminary trained. They are, all they know is that this man his name is Jesus. He's the Messiah. And he, in the case of the woman at the well, knew everything I ever did, even though he really only told her one thing. And then the man possessed by demon legion, he took what the community knew as a man possessed and drove out the demons. And now this man was transformed. So there was just one thing for each case that had been transformed in their life. but they go and testify. They obey and they go and testify of what Jesus had done. In both situations, the next time Jesus and the disciples come through those regions in which those people lived, in the case of the woman at the well, there's 4,000 people ready to receive the gospel. In the case of the man possessed by demon legion, it's the feeding of the 4,000, right? There's 12 to 15,000 people between men, women, and children who are ready to receive the gospel because of those two testimonies, or because of that man's testimony, right? What's going on there? The story is not an end in and of itself. It doesn't solve the problem, right? It just prepares the listener to receive the gospel. So then when Jesus and the disciples share the gospel through the feeding of the 4,000, all of those people are prepared because of that man's testimony, because of his story. And so we have to start figuring out ways in which we can incorporate story, the use of testimony, in our communication efforts if we're ever going to be effective at reaching unengaged and unreached people in the digital space. This is something to think about. Church, this is a call to start using story and testimony. We've punted on it. We've stopped using it. When we look at most of the content being produced by the church right now in our research, it's less than 1% that is real, true story. And we need to make a shift. If we're going to be effective in this place, if we're going to be using digital for our efforts, we have to start with story.